we have these mixed emotions towards someone we love. Love on the one hand, but hostility on the other, which leads to guilt. Like a part of us feels genuinely guilty that we want to throttle someone we love. So there's guilt. And all of that gets buried in one form or another.
Okay.
Now, back to splitting and projection. So the adaptation that some people engage in, and particularly children actually, is that, you know what? All this anxiety that I have, this dreadful, crippling anxiety about wanting to hurt someone that I also love, I know a fix for that. This is unconscious, by the way. It's not like it's thought out like this, but just to kind of give it a voice, right? So I know a fix. The solution is I'm just going to look at my mom as a piece of garbage. I'm going to ignore, I'm going to tune out or split off the fact that I love her, the fact that she has these redeeming, wonderful qualities. I'm going to tune that out or split that off. And I'm just going to see her as a piece of garbage. Then there's no conflict. You're not conflicted at that point, because what made you conflicted was the mixed emotion of both loving and hating. That's what created the conflict. So insofar as you can ignore and tune out that you love this person and that they have redeeming qualities, voila, problem solved.
My own personal experience with cognitive behavioral therapy when I was younger,
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
I was having recurrent issues with a nightmare I kept on having over and over and over again. So I went
Mm-hmm.
to seek out like what's going on. I'm having the same dream like
Mm-hmm.
every night, and it's scary. Like I keep on waking
Mm-hmm.
up and feeling in a certain way. And I don't necessarily want to go into that right now, but the
Mm-hmm.
at some point during my therapy, I became frustrated with the passivity of my
Mm-hmm.
therapist. I felt that I was doing 95% of the talking and I wanted to do like maybe 90-10 or something. I don't know exactly what it was at the time, but I remember almost trying to pick a fight with them. Like, are you letting me get away with this? What I'm saying right now?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I could be
Mm-hmm.
BSing you right now and
Mm-hmm.
I'm not getting any response. Like,
Mm-hmm.
part of the problem was I've been
Mm-hmm.
trying to understand who they were
Mm-hmm.
as a clinician by trying to understand the theory
Mm-hmm.
behind the
Mm-hmm.
theory of their practice. And when I didn't
Right.
see them fulfilling a role, rightfully
Mm-hmm.
or wrongly, there's no
Mm-hmm.
saying now,
Mm-hmm.
it
Mm-hmm.
led to eventual conflict. And my
Mm-hmm.
experience is not unique.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Again, with an open mind to the fact that maybe you are, but you're not aware of it. You always have to be open to the possibility that the patient is picking up on something that you're not conscious of. But if it's your determination that there is a discrepancy, that they're actually not relating to you in a way that is commensurate to the way you are, right? Then you begin to bring that to their attention. And you say, I noticed that you're becoming combative with me, or I noticed that you seem to be doing both parts of the relationship here. You answer your own questions and so on and so forth. Would it be okay with you if we take a few minutes to investigate and explore what might be happening here between us? Because maybe this connects to what originally brought you in. Okay. So
Okay.
first you want their permission to even investigate the matter. Assuming you have that permission, then you look into it and you say, what's going on here? What am I doing or saying that leads you to the conclusion that I'm doing X, Y, and Z or whatever, right? What you're hoping for, Nathan, is that the patient will begin to become aware that the way you really are is quite different from what they were thinking. You
Mhm.
want the patient to become aware of their own distortion mechanism. Then you could say, would it be in line with your priorities that together we investigate and get to the bottom of what's happening, that a part of your mind is distorting me? And is it only here with me that you end up seeing me as a jerk? Or is that also happening in other relationships and in other parts of your life? And they might say, no, this is something I'm actually quite familiar with. I do this a lot, actually. And then you could say, is that part of what brought you to me? Is that part of what you're wanting to get to the bottom of? And then you're off and running. Then you can get to the underlying drivers. Eventually, you'll get to the uncle, but that's like at the end of the causal sequence here.
Okay. Yes, I
You
jumped a few
see,
steps there then. Okay.
yeah, but
'Cause-
you get to that eventually, you see.
okay. Yeah, because I'm not sure how I would react if someone did that other than try to observe their behavior.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm back with Nathan, who I previously referred to a novice from another discipline. We met once before and discussed a Davanloo book, and we had a good time. Hopefully it was, yeah, there it is. There's the book. Yep. And hopefully it was interesting to you, the viewer, as well. And so we're back for round two. So Nathan, what's on your mind when it comes to the reading that we've been doing?
Last time we talked a little bit about the uh, therapeutic alliance, what that might mean from a layman's perspective. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the Milan's two triangles, one of the triangle conflict and the personal conflict, and how are these are not only useful for the clinician that you are to help frame your approach to helping someone solve a neuroses, but how it might be helpful to the client as well, and whether or not it's even appropriate that the client is aware of what the triangle conflict is. I saw some papers outside this book, sort of mixed reviews about that approach. It depends, I guess, but maybe I'd like to hear from you.
The last thing you said about mixed reviews about the triangle of conflict, or both the triangles, or what are you referring to?
Specifically about integrating that into a therapeutic sort of session, as far as being explicit and explaining what the conflict is, rather than just executing it as like a plan, if that makes sense. So the therapist may be aware of it, but the client may not necessarily be primed for that kind of thing, or might be inappropriate, because one of the reviews that I saw was that it sort of intellectualizes the whole process, or makes it feel like they're part of a rigid system, when in reality it's about the dynamic of what happens between the client, the therapist, and a sort of a feeling, or in this case the triangle conflict, defense, feeling, and anxiety, and the person of conflict, the past person, the current person, and then the therapist, or the source of transference, which is the therapist. I'm just wondering what your thoughts on these were. First of all, the distinctions between those two Milan's two triangles, and whether or not it's appropriate to even talk about it with the client on a regular basis or not.
No, I appreciate that question. So I can weigh in on that. So it's imperative for the client to have insight into their inner workings. And so what that means is that it's really important that the client not only gains cognitive insight, but also experiential insight, meaning it's not just a theory, but that it's experiential. And so you can't forego helping the patient see their own triangles, and particularly their own triangle of conflict. Having said that, though, it's often not all that helpful if it's done in a way that is experience distant, meaning it's more theoretical. Because if that were to be helpful, then you can just give the patient a textbook, right, and they can read it. And so just giving the patient a theory, that they can subscribe to, it's like, okay, an interesting theory, but in order for psychological and emotional healing to actually take place, it has to be experiential. And so at a ground level, what that actually means and looks like is that if you're telling me that you suffer from major depression and you want my help resolving that, or at least making a major dent in it, I might ask you, could we look at a recent example of when your depression was perhaps particularly profound and severe, okay? And you tell me, well, Tuesday morning when I woke up, I got a call from my ex-girlfriend. She cussed me out, and then she hung up. And after that, I just had this sinking feeling in my stomach, and I stayed in bed for the rest of the day. I'm normally quite depressed throughout, but I was particularly depressed on the heels of my ex-girlfriend having done that to me. Okay? So then I might ask the patient, are you aware of what feelings you were having then, or even perhaps now, just thinking about it, towards your ex-girlfriend for having cussed you out? Okay? They might say, not really. All I know is the sinking feeling, and then that I stayed in bed the whole day. Okay. At which point the therapist can then say, do you think it's possible that this sinking feeling and this depression and then staying in bed the whole day that unconsciously that papered over and replaced what you were actually feeling towards her for being so rude towards you. So that's the triangle of conflict, but it doesn't sound like I'm throwing a textbook at you, does it? Where,
Well,
go ahead, go ahead.
I'm going to latch on to a word you just said there. So when you use the word unconscious, you're a
Mm-hmm.
clinician. That means something to you.
Mm-hmm.
In common parlance, that might mean something different, say, to an individual who's not necessarily as sophisticated as you when it comes to the theory
Mm-hmm.
latent
Mm-hmm.
um, presuppositions surrounding your discipline. So
Mm-hmm.
my question is, how much cultural buy-in does someone have to have? Let's say when we're using words like unconscious and we're using terms like
Mm-hmm.
forces and you said major
Mm-hmm.
depression in the very beginning
Mm-hmm.
when someone's
Mm-hmm.
almost
Mm-hmm.
self-diagnosing themselves for the reason they're being there. Sort of like in the consensus part of this, the problem,
Mm-hmm.
they're feeling majorly depressed. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Last time when we talked about this, one of
Mm-hmm.
my concerns was since this was being developed in around the time when the DSM-3 was being uh, sort of codified, if you want to say
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One of my what I was having a hard time understanding is if we don't refer to some sort of standard across, let's
Mm-hmm.
say, the different disciplines of psychotherapy, whether it be short term, like this,
Mm-hmm.
or long term, or traditional long form
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
discussions, or even cognitive behavioral therapy,
Mm-hmm.
how can we even work with that material, that psychic material that's being uh, placed in front of you? Are we also looking for somatic, physical cues as well when we're asking someone, like, how do you feel right now? Because we have the past where someone might be able to use a word like, I feel major
Mm-hmm.
depression, but in the
Mm-hmm.
moment, in this triangle, right? So we have
Mm-hmm.
here the past self. It may be almost intellectual sounding. Right now, we may have words to describe our self, or maybe you can observe it.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something here? What would the third thing? That's you, the facilitator, then the person that's helping with the transference. How does the transference play into this part here when we're building up a consensus for the problems, the
Yeah,
hopefully the goals that stem out of the problems,
right.
and then the therapeutic task? How does that work?
Well, if the patient either enters the office with ready-made thoughts and feelings about the therapist, then the transference pole on the triangle person would be relevant. But if there hasn't been a buildup of emotionally laden reactions towards the therapist, then it wouldn't really be relevant. Then at that stage, it's not a factor. It's not a factor. And so
Okay.
if you come in and you have not yet really developed any emotionally charged, laden reactions towards your therapist, then the triangle of person is not really activated. It's not in operation, it's more in abeyance. So the triangles, they come into play when there is an emotional activation and there's an old pattern being replicated.
Is that the same as an unconscious activation?
Yeah, typically it is. And so let me speak to that. Or there's two things that you brought up. So
Mm,
first is what do we mean by depression and so on. And so my response to that is that I simply ask the patient, I might say different people mean different things when they say the words major depression. Can you just describe to me what you mean? Like what is your first person
mm,
experience? What is it that you're actually referring to?
mhm.
So I don't get hung up on semantics. I simply ask them for their first person experience. So
Okay.
that speaks to the definition piece.
In the past and then right now.
Yeah, and then the thing about I've never had a patient push back or quibble when I said what I said to you in my role play. I've never had someone say, "Well, what do you exactly mean unconscious?" Somehow people seem to automatically intuit that I just mean that it's outside of their conscious awareness. I've never had someone quibble about that word.
Yeah, I figured as much. I mean, because it is a culture export and it's out in the air. What I'm getting at here, and kind of going back to the original question, just for a moment, when I said we're
Mm-hmm.
unconscious, this seems to be a sort of cultural thing that we can gravitate towards. You can ask anyone in the
Mm-hmm.
English speaking world what their unconscious desire is. they could probably tell you what it is. Whether or not they know the history and then all the technicalities, that doesn't matter. They know how to use the word when they're given a prompt. Tell me what your unconscious was trying to say a minute ago. They might stumble a little bit, but I think they understand where you're aiming at or something, or where the target is. The question is whether or not they understand if, let's say, someone like me or whatever, they come in your office, they kind of learned a little bit about your discipline by Google searching, like they confront you like, so where are you on this triangle of conflict or whatever, right? They confront you kind of like how I'm doing right now. In a way, it might be actually not good for the alliance, I would assume, if someone
Right.
comes in as
Yes.
a
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
No,
Well,
I reason I
right.
ask this
Yeah.
again
Go ahead.
is in cognitive behavioral therapy circles, since it's so popular. Um, People do read about the different sub-disciplines as well, and they'll come into conflict very early on with a therapist that they feel is not being adequate. They're not playing the role, so to speak. And it leads to patients terminating their sessions early before they've reached some sort of resolution, because in their mind, the therapist is supposed to play a certain role, and they're not fulfilling that role because, again, it's kind of like when people get mad at their doctors because they Google search something and they think they know better than their doctor. I think it's analogous
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. It is. Yeah. It
And
is.
I would
Yeah. It is.
just
Yeah.
curious if you encounter that with all this.
Yeah. A little bit. Generally speaking, it's not helpful for the patient to have the theoretical understandings about ISTDP. If they come in and they have this textbook stuff in their minds, usually that's an impediment. And so that circles all the way back to your original query, right? Having to do with, is it helpful or not for the patient to understand the triangles? And long and the short of it is, it's critical that they understand it experientially, the way I just simulated when I played out the guy with depression who didn't get out of bed after his ex-girlfriend had cussed him out, right?
Okay.
That's an experiential, meaning it's a descriptive, phenomenological inquiry into the patient's first person experience. If they can understand the triangles from an experiential point of view, the way I just described, meaning it's phenomenological, meaning it has to do with their first person experience as they move through their day to day, hour to hour, then it's exceedingly helpful and it's critical. Like you're not going to get that far if the patient doesn't gain experiential insight and understanding into intrapsychic causality, meaning
Okay.
what's actually causing what on the inside.
Okay.
And the triangle of person also critical to understand experientially, less so just theoretically.
So this is by Milan in the chapter about evidence. He's anticipating the reader's reaction by saying, the reader's reaction may well be the present author, who once had the reputation of being an objective seeker of truth, has fallen under the influence of a charismatic personality and has completely lost touch with reality. He's talking about sort of like this fake cult of Davanloo or something like that. Given Davanloo's personality, his personal philosophies, and his ability to transmit this information over time. Okay. The first answer is under certain conditions, it is possible to prove the effectiveness of the method of therapy beyond all reasonable doubt without the use of a control series. These conditions are as follows. One, and please interrupt me at any time. There's a few of these. I think we maybe touch upon them, but I'd like your input at any point. One, the patients chosen have suffered from crippling symptoms and other severe disturbances, e.g., behavioral patterns such as passivity and grossly unsatisfactory human relations for many years, even for 1 or 2 decades. Okay. Two, in some of these patients, years of the psychoanalytic and/or behavior therapy have failed to produce improvement. So that's 2. 3, the patients are taken to the treatment, begin to show major improvements within the first 2 weeks, and show complete recovery, say after 15 weeks. The ratio of 20 years to 15 weeks is nearly 70. Okay. 4, no relapse occurs during a follow-up period of many years. all these conditions have been fulfilled in Davanloo's work. Moreover, the evidence does not end here. The following conditions must also apply. And you underline this quite a lot in the book when your copy that you gave me. So this is the reason I wanted to bring it up. Something was important about this next one. So 5, okay. In patient after patient, it can be demonstrated that improvements begin immediately following certain types of events in therapy, particularly the open acknowledgement of hostility in the transference, followed by an interpretation linking patterns in the transference relationship with similar patterns in current and past relationships. Davanloo refers to this as the TCP interpretation and has demonstrated time and time again with audiovisual proof the impact of such interpretations on the patient both during therapy and in the initial interview itself. If maybe we could take a pause. I've been talking a bit. Could we maybe talk about the number 5 and why that was important too?
Well, that part is unquestionably true. I've seen it thousands of times, and I've also experienced it myself. So the last part I see as unquestionably true. The first part of everything you rattled off sounds kind of grandiose to me. I can't weigh in as to whether it's true or not in terms of, the miraculous outcomes after one session and so on. I mean, I've read about that, but it has a grandiose flavor to me. And so I'm slightly skeptical of the first part. But the last part is absolutely true, that at a certain juncture in a particular therapy session, when the therapist is able to facilitate a kind of experience where the patient can actually feel an hostility that has always been simmering, but they haven't been fully in touch with it. And not just the hostility, but the impulse connected to the hostility, which will involve some form of the urge to lash out. And that could go, that could be mild from the side of, wanting to say something hurtful all the way over here to the side of homicidal rage. So it's not about acting it out, but if you can internally acknowledge that, yeah, there is this part of me that would really want to lash out at this very moment, it usually comes with this major drastic drop in anxiety and tension. And you can feel it. I've felt it many times myself. It's like a valve has been turned and anxiety just leaves your body, and there's this major euphoric release in tension, and your thinking clears up and you can think really clearly and you feel really grounded and centered and slightly euphoric. So that I've experienced many, many times myself, and it's something that I see on the daily.
So this is not just a almost metaphysical claim. This is a somatic claim about the body itself. When you were talking about especially when you're talking about the valve being released, that really invokes Freud a lot for me. And I think we spoke about this maybe last time or off camera about looking at Freud within the context of his time, trying to ground his psychoanalytic insights with empiricism, where in a way he was almost comparing man with maybe like a clock or a vessel or something that has valves, and there's pressure that builds up and steam. Like we talk about blowing off steam and this kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's very Freudian, where when you're talking about this observation you've had even within yourself. I think that's kind of interesting. Is this the overcoming of the ego, the superego defense, when this happens, when someone's able to finally actually have an emotion, as you were saying, or finally be able to confront something that they had not wanted to confront? And if it's not the superego, the sort of the overcoming of the superego defense, what is it? I'm trying to bridge the old world with the new world, and if there's a nomenclature or some sort of parlance I can use, that'd be very helpful.
Sure. Well, roughly speaking, yes, you're correct. Now, the superego is one of 3 parts of the psyche, as Freud formulated it. And so it's a function in the mind that stems from internalized messages from parental figures or caretakers or the environment, also connected to and fueled by aggression turned on the self. Because typically when you're a 5-year-old kid, It's not always safe to approach one of your parents and say, "Hey, I'm really mad at you. I'd like for you to get run over by a bus." Typically, parents don't say, "I don't blame you for feeling that way. Let's talk about it." Typically, the
Mm-mm.
kiddo will fear some kind of punitive consequence. So they learn quickly that those kinds of feelings are unacceptable. And so where are they going to go? They have to stuff them and bottle them up. And then what you see is then self-criticism and other self-punitive tendencies. And
So the
so,
past person, the past person.
yeah, exactly. On the triangle of person, we have that's the P. Exactly.
Mhm. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. 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 Thank you for
So,
that.
so yeah. So, insofar as getting access to that hostility represents overcoming a defense that was clearly self-defeating, then yes, you have overcome the resistance of the superego. So that's how we might articulate it. Now, another point which would be important to make is that as relieving as it can be to just experience that hostility and then the draining of the anxiety and so forth, as relieving as that can be, often that's only the beginning. Typically, for deeper healing and greater character change, you need to get to deeper pathogenic zones within the unconscious. And what that means in layman's terms is that there are other feelings typically underneath the rage that are crucial to get to help the patient experience. And usually they involve grief, tenderness, guilt slash remorse about having been so angry and having wanted to be so hurtful towards someone we also love. And it's the complex ball of wax of all the feelings, not just the hostility, that ultimately is profoundly healing and leads to character change.
Yeah, because it's maybe you can correct me here, but it's sort of like let's say you're able to have that feeling, but that feeling isn't going to necessitate any sort of change. For instance, let's say I discover that a good
Mm-hmm.
way for me to relieve anxiety is to punch my pillow. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
so built up, I'm tense, and the only thing
Mm-hmm.
I could do at the time is just punch a pillow or something. Punching
Mm-hmm.
the pillow isn't going to build anything as far as my relationships with other people go. From a pragmatic standpoint, it's sort of just a release. Question is, are you able, as a therapist, are you trained as a therapist to recognize these things? It would be obvious if someone punched the wall or a pillow or something, but if someone's
Mm-hmm.
having a euphoric moment, they're finally
Mm-hmm.
able to just let it go. Maybe they've been bottling resentment and they're finally
Mm-hmm.
willing, at least in the context of therapy, to
Mm-hmm.
confront their father or something,
Mm-hmm.
or tell
Mm-hmm.
their partner how they really feel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How does the individual on the side
Mm-hmm.
of the client follow up on this? Or do you later on follow up with them, say, hey, last time we spoke about your how you were going to confront your father or your lover, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Did you do it? Or do you let them tell you?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Well, in ISTDP, it is rare to give behavioral homework. I do it at times, but when I am doing that, I have stepped outside of the general parameters of ISTDP. So I can be eclectic at times, and so it's not like I'm never behavioral. There's a time and place for that in my book. But from an ISTDP point of view, you would rarely see a conversation where the therapist gives the patient behavioral homework. So that would rarely happen. What's more common is that as you're interacting with the patient, they get a false notion that somehow they think that the therapist is encouraging them to actually take action in the real world and confront my father or this or that. At which point the therapist typically explains, no, 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 I'm not talking about whether or not you express it or you tell so and so about how you feel. That isn't what we're talking about right now. This is an inside job. I'm asking you to what extent on the inside are you aware of what you're feeling towards so and so? And so you often have to clarify that this isn't about a behavioral approach to doing X, Y, and Z. This is an inside job. Are you feeling it internally or not? And you're absolutely right. Hitting the pillow, shouting to the heavens, that's what we call explosive discharge of anxiety. It just
Mhm.
blows off steam. It takes the edge off anxiety and does nothing else.
Okay. So that'd be counterproductive then to the therapeutic tasks they may have sort of aligned with early on, because if the point of the matter is you're looking to be more assertive as an individual, and
Mm,
a part of that is you're unable to confront your father, and that's
mhm,
the past
mhm,
you, the present you, and the feeling you're
mm,
having. When it
mhm,
comes to the anxiety that's drawn out of that in the triangle conflicts, we have the defense,
mm,
you're
mhm,
you're
mhm,
you're a
mhm,
pushover,
mhm,
you have a feeling, you're aware of this at some level, and then there's anxiety there. The feeling that comes from the euphoria, that should be a secondary concern opposed to sort of a behavioral change that the individual makes on their own. What I was getting at, but not the homework part. I think I know what you're talking about, where someone, a therapist might say, "Well, I need you to go and talk to people and to maybe do like an Adler experiment where, I don't know if you know about this. Adler, to overcome his fear of women,
mm,
he went and asked 100 women on dates. Okay,
mhm, mhm,
and
mhm,
over time, he got better at
mhm,
talking to
mhm,
women, and he sort of
mhm,
overcame his fear. So he would give
mhm,
patients
mhm,
homework, not exactly like that, but you know, so in IDSP,
mhm,
you don't give homework, but would you follow up with, you saw someone have an unconscious breakthrough, and you're pretty sure at this point when they leave your office,
mhm.
the point of the therapy isn't just to keep an office,
Right, right.
it's to learn, it's the training, and that's the part of the thing that I was getting from this, that it's an active participation. they're
Mhm,
going
mhm,
they're going to mobilize their own changes on the real world
mhm. You would hope so, yeah.
without pressing them on that. Do they
Mhm.
often share that with you, or is
Yeah,
it
they do.
something that just comes out passively, like they mention, oh, and by the way, I finally talked to my dad or whatever?
Well, they're often excited and they come in and say, I'm noticing changes. I was able to stand up to my father. And that tends to come from the patient spontaneously. It isn't something that I prompt them on. I might ask them when they come in if we had an intense session the last time. I might say, we had an intense session last week. Are there any developments that you think I should know about since we saw each other? And then they might share that information. But oftentimes they just, they want to share it because they're celebratory. They're so happy about the progress.
Are you,
But
are you ever worried about about them wanting you to celebrate with them in a way, is like they're looking for approval? So in this
no,
transference, in the
yeah,
essence of
yeah,
transference, at some
yeah,
point you have to terminate your sessions with someone. And if they get
yeah.
to a point where they're actually overcoming a lot of their
Mm-hmm,
early obstacles and they're building the tools
mm-hmm,
with them,
mm-hmm,
are early terminations actually possibly a good sign that someone's therapy is going well, if they're able to actualize the changes that they're making through a
mm-hmm,
unconscious breakthrough in the session with
mm-hmm,
you?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
How how does that work? How does that work? Because we're talking very short set. We're talking, let's say, 15 sessions or something, right? You were mentioning
mm-hmm,
the last video. Like that's
mm-hmm,
probably a better aim than the one session where you just meet someone. In fact,
mm-hmm,
they even make mention in this, something that frustrated Freud is that he had an encounter with a young woman who was falling around one time at a hike or something, and over the course
mm-hmm,
of 4 or 5 hours, she said she was cured of whatever anxiety that she had, and he could never bottle that
mm-hmm,
magic, and it frustrated him that,
mm-hmm,
like, he wasn't able to replicate
mm-hmm,
in his later life based
mm-hmm,
on the insights he had of the human psyche when it comes to the actual
mm-hmm.
dealings of actually doing therapy.
Yep,
So
one off.
yeah, it was like maybe got lucky or something, or
Yeah,
it was
yeah,
something else. We don't have a follow up with the lady to even know if it worked. We don't know if the
mm-hmm,
story's true. Like there's a lot in it
yeah,
that I
yeah,
tried to do some investigating. Like, hey, this is kind of interesting. This is like is
mm-hmm,
there like
mm-hmm,
something written about this
yeah,
substantial from Freud? But it was more like his diaries and stuff. So
mm-hmm,
I
mm-hmm.
don't mean to get sidetracked with Freud, but
No, no, but just to speak to what you were bringing up then. And so there's a couple of things to keep in mind. Of course, we're always concerned about reinforcing a transference resistance where we become someone else in the patient's mind, even if it isn't fully conscious. And we're always mindful of that, ideally anyway. But there is also such a thing as just an ordinary human experience. So I wouldn't assume that if a patient is really pleased because they're progressing and they want to take a 2-minute victory lap celebrating that with me, I would not assume that that necessarily means that I've stepped into some transferential shoes. I would do the human thing and be happy for them and take a victory lap for a minute or two, right? And then move on. And so let's get to work, kind of a thing.
I ask because there's something really crude that happens
Oh,
in my investigations of this. I was
mm-hmm.
reading about Freud and the celebrations that he had with patients when they
Mm-hmm.
came to him with breakthroughs outside in their waking life. And as you
Mm-hmm.
probably know, I mean, he slept with many of his patients and things like that. And well, I'm not saying practitioners
Mm-hmm.
of ICB are doing the same thing, but how do you
Mm-hmm.
celebrate? I mean, you do the human thing, but
Mm-hmm.
is there a
Mm-hmm.
governor there? There's something in the back of your mind like I need to still be professional. Like what kind of things do you say in your mind to be human, of course, to sort of
Mm-hmm.
yes, let's
Mm-hmm.
celebrate. This is an accomplishment. This
Mm-hmm.
is awesome. This is one of the reasons you're here without overstepping your bounds professionally, ethically, or even as a
Yeah.
practitioner to not
Yeah.
develop bad habits on your own so that you're not
Well,
stepping into that shoe
yeah.
of transference resistance.
Yeah. Well, I go to the cupboard, I take some whiskey out, take out 2 shot glasses. We pour each other a drink, and no, of course not. Of course not. Of course not. No, I say things like, "Well, that's wonderful. Nice going. Wow, that's incredible." And and then they elaborate on it and they share more details, and I smile and I light up and I'm happy for them and I say, "I'm very happy for you. Wonderful." And so then at a certain point though, now this is important, if they just want to spend the whole session celebrating, like if it takes more than 3-4 minutes, then usually it's either a resistance that has to be dealt with, right? Or maybe they're ready to terminate, like there's no more issue to address, nothing left to work on. So at that point you'd have to make that determination, of course. But if they didn't come in with the intention of saying goodbye, and yet they're just wanting to over and over celebrate and talk about how good their life is going and so on, at that point, yeah, you have to deal with that and say, well, on the one hand, I'm very happy for you, but on the other, I'm noticing that you're staying in this mode and you're not rolling up the sleeves to
Oh,
work on anything. What does that mean?
they say like so if the celebration and them sharing is disproportionate with the reason for them being there, is
Yeah.
that kind of a way
Yeah, yeah.
of
Yeah,
saying it? If it
that's a good
if
way
it
of putting
becomes
it.
a fixation, perhaps,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps there's like even like a let's say in the case of the ex girlfriend or something or ex boyfriend, there might even be
Mm-hmm.
some a tinge of cruelty if they confronted someone who had hurt them, and if they're
Mm-hmm.
fixated on that, there might actually be some sort of underlying moral issue too, where they're hurting someone back. Let's say they did
Mm-hmm.
eventually confront that person and they made that person feel bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we bring in those determinations, let's say as a therapist,
Mm-hmm.
are you weighing this sort of hurt for hurt kind of dynamic that might be happening there? And when they're looking for your approval of this, how do you deal with that? Let's say in your mind,
Mm-hmm.
based on the perception that they give you of this imaginary
Mm-hmm.
person for all you know,
Mm-hmm.
they hurt them back by confronting them. They finally, like, I finally did the training, like I finally did it, and now I'm the bully or whatever.
Oh, I
How do
see.
you, and they want to possibly terminate early because of this. They
Mm-hmm.
accomplished their goal, right? Maybe they had a
Mm-hmm.
goal of like I need to be more assertive, and
Mm-hmm.
there's people in my past, and there's people in my past need to be confronted. They finally
Mm-hmm.
do the thing out in the real world, and they want to terminate their sessions because they've accomplished their
Mm-hmm.
goal.
Mm-hmm.
How do you encourage them to continue to work with you because you realize that actually you basically help create a bully or something? Or
Mm-hmm.
does that maybe that's the wrong word, but I'm just trying to put it in layman's terms.
No, 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 I get it. I'm following you.
Okay.
Well, I would question them. I would say I can hear that you're very pleased, but it seems like you're conflating assertiveness and aggression. And here's my concern. I hear that you feel like you're ready to terminate, and that's your prerogative. But here's my concern. My concern is that if this is how you're going to approach people, then you'll die a lonely man. No one's going to want to be around you when you're engaging in these bullying behaviors. That repels people. And so it seems like a dreadful interpersonal strategy to me, even though you seem quite pleased with it. So maybe we need to spend a few minutes. How would you feel about spending a few minutes to investigate this to see if we can find some common ground? And if not, no problem. We could say goodbye if you want to.
Yeah. Would we count that as successful therapy? Let's say they're self-reporting that they've accomplished their goals. Like they had a problem,
Mhm,
they had
mhm,
goals, and then you guys had a therapeutic task. In their
mhm,
mind,
mhm,
they're better, right? You you might even go to that person 5 years from now and ask them,
mhm,
"Hey, are you better?" And they,
mhm,
"Oh yeah,
mhm,
this was the
mhm,
best thing ever." But in
mhm.
reality, they're just a giant bully now.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
I know this is an extreme example,
Yeah,
but
it's good. It's good.
there might be some shades of gray between that extreme example and people who may terminate their sessions early because they think they've succeeded or they feel they have.
Right.
And
Yeah.
do you count that as a victory, a personal victory, as a therapist or as
Mhm.
a clinician of this
Well, I
brand of
wouldn't.
psychotherapy? You
I
wouldn't.
wouldn't
Okay.
personally. No, I would not. I mean, I have a happy customer. Okay, fine.
Yeah. Hmm.
But the customer, the client, is clearly conflating assertiveness and aggression,
Hmm.
and they are clearly lacking in insight into the self-defeating nature of bullying behavior and how isolated that is going to leave them. So no, I would count that as a major failure, even if I had a happy customer.
I was trying to find instances of this very scenario within Davanloo's own works as far as any
Mm.
sort of transcript or something I could reach, and I couldn't find anything. But I
Mm.
imagine this might be a common theme across not just IDCP, but even CBT or even, say, court mandated therapy for people who, let's say,
Mhm.
there's a criminal element or something where they have the court orders, 12 sessions for someone to go to anger management. They may have similar, not exactly the consensus that we have here,
Mhm.
but they may have some sort of
Mhm.
mandate where they have
Mhm.
some problem, they're aggressive or they're not being aggressive enough or whatever it may be. They have
Mhm.
goals and they have some sort of task that's
Mhm.
it's provisional on, let's say, their release or something like that, or being able to be on parole or whatever. We may have a lot of false positives if what you're saying
Mhm.
is true,
Yeah.
and I think it probably is true, not necessarily for ICP per se, but just mean say talk therapy in general. Do you have any
Mhm. Mhm.
insights into that? I think I
Well,
may
I
have
don't
asked you
have.
this in private once or twice about whether or not you see ICP being a good candidate for uh, reintegrating people who've been incarcerated into society by
Mhm.
being very, I mean, it is short term. It may actually be very good for this type of thing, especially when there's court mandates, but maybe it wouldn't be because of the nature of the clients that come into your work in the
Mhm.
first place. Maybe it doesn't work.
Mhm. Mhm. No, I think it's a good candidate. I don't have insights into the actual statistics and the outcome data around all of this, but I'm of the opinion that ISTDP has built-in safeguards that would readily and quickly spot these potential vulnerabilities in a particular patient. And so when we talk about helping a patient access and experience, and to some extent express, at least verbally, hostility towards other people, it's imperative that we're monitoring and assessing to what extent is the patient viewing the person they're angry with as a three-dimensional figure versus unidimensional. For example, if I have a patient and the patient is saying, I'm really furious with so and so, let's say with my boyfriend, okay,
Hmm.
then I would inquire into that experience, which would involve not just the somatic component of the experience, but also the cognitive and perceptual. What are they thinking? What are they perceiving? Right? What is their assessment of what happened and precipitated their anger? And if the data points in the direction that the patient is looking at the boyfriend in a unidimensional manner, like he's just a piece of shit without any redeeming qualities, then it's a mistake to encourage that hostility. And at that point, instead, you would prioritize helping the patient see that she's angry towards a demonized version of the boyfriend without any redeeming qualities. So you would not at all encourage the hostility at that point. You would encourage the patient to see the boyfriend more three-dimensionally.
Mm-hmm.
And
Reason I brought up, go ahead.
Well, just to finish that, because the reason that that's a mitigating factor is that treating another person poorly is not really plausible if you can really tune into them as a three-dimensional person with all of their redeeming qualities. In other words, treating someone poorly typically requires that you have to devalue that person in order to justify treating them poorly. So that's why it's a safeguard.
Okay. Yeah, one of the reasons I brought that up because I was looking at the effectiveness, just more or less. I wasn't getting too detailed. Effectiveness of talk therapy for people who've been incarcerated. So people who've committed, especially heinous crimes, like physical acts of violence, where they may not have the same sort of impulse control as the regular populace. Looking at them as a panel and saying, okay, would this type of therapy, your type of therapy, be good for that cohort of people or not? Or if there's something presumptive about a person who might enter your office, for instance.
Well, we would modify the technique. So there's standardized TDP and the graded format of ISTDP. So if someone has impulse control issues, we would never in a million years do standardized TDP. It would be unethical, totally contraindicated. And so with the graded approach, it's a far gentler affair. And we actually build up the client's capacity before we try to de-repress the unconscious. And so it would be really unethical to go for a standard approach if someone has impulse control issues.
Unethical. Can you explain that to me?
Well, think about it. It's like, approaching a patient with impulse control issues and then, doing this excavation work. Yeah, pressuring them and doing this excavation work and de-repressing things that the patient is not able to tolerate. And then they go out and say, rob a bank or commit murder.
Or hit you or something.
Yeah,
or hit you.
or attack the therapist or whatever. And so you just don't do that. Instead you do a graded approach which involves building the patient's ego-adaptive capacity so that eventually down the road they can tolerate the excavation work. But you don't do that right out of the gate with someone with poor impulse control.
In session, not outside of session. So not the homework, but something like an activity of sorts between you and the could you maybe elaborate more on the graded approach? You can be very generic.
Sure.
I think I'll understand once you give me that
Yeah,
way.
yeah. Well, anything that engages the patient's executive functions, their
The
ability
prefrontal
to,
lobe.
the prefrontal lobe, the ability to self-reflect and look at yourself, that will increase impulse control over time and eventually build up capacity. So it's the self-reflective functions that you are over and over inviting the patient to engage. And as those get stronger, the observing ego, as that gets stronger and stronger in the patient, the sturdier they become and the better their impulse control will be. Typically with antisocial features where there's absolutely no remorse and guilt for heinous acts, that typically spells a very, very bad and poor prognoses for the treatment. We also look at what's going on with the patient's anxiety. How is it manifesting? Because according to Davanloo's research, when he looked at all that video material of his patients, he found that when the patient's voluntary skeletal muscle tissue can contain the anxiety, which is manifested in the form of rhythmic hand wringing or sighs because of the pressure on the diaphragm here in the intercostal muscles, or tension in any of the voluntary muscular tissues, the striated skeletal tissue. Davanloo found that when the anxiety is being discharged into that tissue, okay, that is a safeguard, that rarely will you ever see a patient, say, lose their temper or have an impulse control issue while the anxiety is being channeled into that muscle tissue. It also typically indicates when you see sighs or the striated signaling with the hand wringing and so on, it indicates that the patient is at least to some extent connected to something that is internally conflictual for them. Because
They have
to
a
the
theory of
extent,
mind.
yeah, say more, elaborate.
Yeah, so in order to do this and have the somatic responses, they have to have a theory of mind at the present while you're having a discussion, or there's a context in their environment that's precipitating that. What I mean by that is that they're able to have some sort of self-reflection. And by theory of mind, you can also see you imagine what it's like to be in other people's minds. Without
Mm-hmm,
theory of
mm-hmm,
mind, it's impossible to be empathetic
mm-hmm,
because
mm-hmm,
things are literally treated as objects in your world.
mm-hmm. Yes, I
That's where
agree.
the objective is. That's where objectifying someone comes from.
Sure. Well, let's review the nuts and bolts of the metapsychology. In other words, from a psychodynamic lens, right? How do we understand the issues that the patient is presenting with, right? So we're talking about poor impulse control. We're talking about not having a theory of mind, to use your lingo. I like that. We're talking about acting out behaviors that fall within the antisocial realm.
Deviant
Okay.
behavior. Yes.
Yeah, deviant behavior. And so, from an ISTDP point of view, that person is likely engaging in what we call splitting and projection. Yeah.
Explain the connection between the splitting and projection, and maybe just put it in
Mm-hmm.
layman's terms for me. Maybe I missed something there. It sounded like the exact
Sure.
opposite of what I was thinking. Or
Yeah.
was
So
I
let's
confusing there? Was I confusing there?
well, let's hash it out. So what you're describing in terms of not having a theory of mind and seeing people as objects, I see that as the end result of a causal chain. And the causal chain begins, let's make this very concrete. You're a child, let's say, and you're looking at your mom and you're hungry, but she's not available to offer you a bottle or whatever. Okay. So then there's hostility and anger towards the mom, but you love your mom at the same time, and you need her at the same time. She is ultimately the source of comfort and nurturance and so on and so forth. And so you're in a terrible, dreadful bind because on the one hand, you want to throttle your mom, but on the other hand, you love your mom. That conflict is simply unbearable for a lot
Is
of
this
children.
sublimation? In
No.
the Freudian sense, in the psychosexual development, when it comes to say the oral stage,
Mm-hmm.
if you don't have adequate resources in your environment, you
Mm-hmm.
sublimate those feelings because it's hard for a young psyche
Mm-hmm.
to incorporate the thing that you care about the most, the thing that's supposed to care about you the most, your mother,
Mm-hmm.
and the lack
Mm-hmm.
of care. And
Mm-hmm.
is that the process of sublimation? I don't mean to get off track.
No, sublimation is another defense, and it's a higher
Okay.
order defense. So if you
That's,
sublimate, that means you're in a better place. And so, but
oh,
just to
okay,
get
go ahead.
back to the causal chain, right? So
Mhm.
at the origin in ISTDP, this is how we formulate it. We have these mixed emotions towards someone we love. Love on the one hand, but hostility on the other, which leads to guilt. Like a part of us feels genuinely guilty that we want to throttle someone we love. So there's guilt. And all of that gets buried in one form or another.
Okay.
Now, back to splitting and projection. So the adaptation that some people engage in, and particularly children actually, is that, you know what? All this anxiety that I have, this dreadful, crippling anxiety about wanting to hurt someone that I also love, I know a fix for that. This is unconscious, by the way. It's not like it's thought out like this, but just to kind of give it a voice, right? So I know a fix. The solution is I'm just going to look at my mom as a piece of garbage. I'm going to ignore, I'm going to tune out or split off the fact that I love her, the fact that she has these redeeming, wonderful qualities. I'm going to tune that out or split that off. And I'm just going to see her as a piece of garbage. Then there's no conflict. You're not conflicted at that point because what made you conflicted was the mixed emotion of both loving and hating. That's what created the conflict. So insofar as you can ignore and tune out that you love this person and that they have redeeming qualities, voila, problem solved. So
And
now
what about
you've
imaginary
engaged.
friends?
Elaborate.
Yeah, so another solution that a child might come up with
Mm,
if
mm-hmm,
they're suffering through
mm-hmm,
proximal abandonment, they may
mm-hmm.
have an imaginary friend.
True.
We don't often address
Mm-hmm,
the objectification that you're referring to when it comes to seeing your mother as trash. You know,
mm-hmm,
that sort of
mm-hmm,
goes underneath the radar, and because it's
mm-hmm,
repressed for so long, it might
mm-hmm,
manifest in behavioral things later in life, such
mm-hmm,
as, let's say, a
mm-hmm.
young man treating all women who don't give him attention as
Yes.
trash,
Yes.
or
Yeah.
seeing them as lesser or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
It would be far more adaptive if the child grew out of that defense and
Mhm.
started, say, adopting sublimation or other defenses, higher order defenses that are more adaptive. There are rare circumstances in which splitting and projection are adaptive as an adult. And that is if you are a soldier
PTSD.
at yeah, at war, right? If your job is to kill the enemy, and you have to remember the humanity of that enemy and all of their redeeming
Mm.
qualities, it's going to be far harder to kill them. So from a certain point of view, splitting and projection can be adaptive in that context, although that's debatable. But
Yeah, there's like a famous quote by some general said, someone asked him, so what was it like to kill so many people? And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. I've only killed communists. Like he's never
there you
killed,
go.
like, so,
Yeah.
that's exactly what that is. And when
Yep. Yep.
you're trained to be an
Yeah.
executor or being a weapon of war, like
Yeah.
you're no longer a person. You are a thing
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
executing the will of some entity, say a state or
Yeah.
something like that. It
Yeah.
makes sense. And then the consequence of this, though, while it may be
Mm-hmm.
adaptive in the moment in combat, is
Mm-hmm.
that when people come back
Mm-hmm.
and they can have time to reflect,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of post-traumatic stress comes from that.
Yeah.
Um, right. I'm not saying that people who aren't warriors don't have PTSD, but it seems to be very
Mm-hmm.
prevalent with people who
Mm-hmm.
were at one point
Mm-hmm.
treating the other as trash, to kind of use the metaphor,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
a conscious kind of way, like pushing it down for
Mm-hmm.
a little bit, and then
Mm-hmm.
hmm.
Yeah, I agree with you. And so I don't know if that clarifies things, but so what you're
Okay, it
referring
does
to
now.
as
Yeah.
seeing people as objects is simply the end result of that causal chain. That's all it
Yeah.
is. It's the end result.
I do want to point something out here too,
Mm,
with the
mm,
splitting projection. This could be wrong. I'm willing to someone
mm,
fact check me on this, but I think the splitting and projection originally
mm-hmm,
came from the eye and the visual cortex. You can cut
mm-hmm,
off
mm,
the nerves of the eye so that the brain can no longer see, but you might have things like phantom visions and say your peripheral vision from say your right
mm,
eye to your left
mm,
eye. Your brain
mm-hmm,
plays tricks on you, right?
mm-hmm,
It has a lot of information, but it also locks things out. So the projection, sort of the splitting might be an example of splitting might be
mm,
um, at any moment you can see your nose, but your brain turns
mm,
it off because you don't need to see it. Projection might be stereoscopic vision, as in
mm,
we're seeing with two eyes, but we're really seeing as a single picture, right? So
mm,
when we
mm-hmm,
split and project,
mm-hmm,
it
mm-hmm.
has to do with our vision,
Oh
which
yeah.
is
Oh
the
yeah.
eye to vision being the eye to the unconscious. So
Mm.
it'd be kind of cool exploring that
Yeah,
at some point. But
that could be a
that's why I was
physiological.
confused
Hmm.
because I'm always thinking in terms like where do these phrases come
Mm,
from? They just come
mm,
out of
mm,
nowhere. If they're
mm-hmm,
making a physical analog, vision would be a good one.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I
Splitting,
agree.
I don't know if that's helpful or if that's even
No, I
true,
like
but
that. No, I like that. Right.
okay,
Brilliant.
cool,
Yeah,
cool,
that could
cool,
be,
cool.
you could be onto something for sure.
I don't know, maybe. Okay.
To circle back to what you brought up towards the beginning of our meeting, you were painting a picture of a patient who has studied up and boned up on ISTDP metapsychology
Mhm,
and theory.
mhm,
And you were simulating a patient who was finding fault in the therapist.
mhm.
Well, wait a minute, I don't, you're missing this or that, and what have you. Do you remember that at the beginning of our
Yeah,
meeting?
I do. I brought it for
Okay,
a very specific reason too. So if you'd like to hear that reason, but from personal
elaborate.
experience, my own personal experience with cognitive behavioral therapy when I was younger,
Mm-hmm.
I
mhm,
I was having recurrent issues with a nightmare I kept on having over and over and over again. So I went
mhm,
to seek out like what's going on. I'm having the same dream like
mm,
every night, and it's scary. Like I keep on waking
mm,
up and feeling in a certain way. And
mm,
I don't necessarily want to go into that right now, but the
mhm,
at some point during my therapy, I became frustrated with the passivity of my
mm,
therapist. I felt that I was doing
mm,
95% of the talking and I wanted to do like
mm,
maybe 90-10 or something. I
mhm,
don't know exactly what it was at the
mhm,
time,
mhm,
but I remember almost trying to pick a fight with them. Like, are you letting me
mhm,
get away with this? What I'm saying right now?
mhm,
Like, I
mhm,
could be
mhm,
BSing you right now and
mhm,
I'm not getting any response. Like, and
mhm,
part of the problem was I've been
mhm,
trying to understand who they were
mhm,
as a clinician by trying to understand the theory
mhm,
behind the
mhm.
theory of their practice. And I didn't
Right.
see them fulfilling a role, rightfully
Mhm,
or wrongly. There's no
mhm,
saying now.
mhm,
It led
mhm,
to eventual conflict. And my
mhm,
experience is not
mhm,
unique. With the
mhm,
internet and things
mhm,
like that, people will search for
mhm,
specific types of therapists they're looking for. Like,
mhm,
I'm having an
mhm,
existential crisis, therefore I need an
mhm,
existential therapist,
mhm. Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Or,
yeah.
or at one point I was looking for a Gestalt therapist because I had read some
Mm,
stuff about Gestalt therapy,
mhm,
and eventually I was doing the shopping around. I found the therapist right for me, but it wasn't
mm,
the theory about any of these
mm,
practices that actually helped. It was like it's like putting in the
mhm,
work and the effort to be there and
mm,
be and
mm,
being present and all this kind of stuff,
mm,
things that I
mm,
didn't really appreciate. But I noticed a lot
mm,
of,
mm,
and I don't mean to put young men out there, a lot of young men are
mm,
prone to this type of behavior, and I don't know
mm,
why.
mm,
I don't
mm.
know why.
Well, first of all, I really appreciate you sharing all of that. Thank you very much. That's really moving that you're willing to share that. Number one.
Mhm,
Um, let's see. So on the one hand, if we go to this binary again about the clinical and the ordinary and the human. So from an ordinary human point of view, it makes perfect sense that if you're growing wary and mistrustful of your therapist, that they're actually pulling their weight and doing what they're supposed to do, that you'd want to learn about, wait a minute, how is this actually supposed to go? Right? It makes perfect sense, right? So from an ordinary human point of view, okay. Now, clinically, if you were my patient, which you're not, of course, but if you were, just
mhm,
hypothetically,
mhm,
and you brought this to my attention or you started becoming combative, I would want to drill down to the source of it, like what is happening here. So the first principle that I would adhere to is just to try to understand what is going on for you. And it sounds like if we were to pull on that thread, we would pretty quickly get to your frustration towards me and your mistrust that I'm actually pulling my weight.
mhm,
And so I would want to drill down to those basic facts that you're frustrated or angry and mistrustful that I'm actually pulling my weight. Then my task would be to look at whether or not there could be merit to those concerns. Like maybe
mhm.
there is, maybe I'm burned out and,
Let me follow up
actually
on this
not.
then.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Let me tell you the short story that happened after the confrontation. It did take the
mm-hmm,
therapist
mm-hmm,
by a little bit surprise. They were actually
mm-hmm,
surprised in their seat that I was doing this because
mm-hmm,
I was usually
mm-hmm,
fairly composed in session. And
mm-hmm,
they explained exactly what you just said. You know what? I'm
mm-hmm,
going to be honest with you.
mm-hmm,
I'm somewhat exhausted. I may be working too
mm-hmm.
much.
There
They were completely honest with me
yeah.
and say, and it's not your fault. I want you to know that, and I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
try to do better in our next
Mm,
session if you can
mm,
trust
mm,
me. And that got my trust because
mhm,
they
mhm,
were actually honest with me when
mhm, mhm.
they could have hid
BS'd
behind
you.
their profession or something, or they could
Yeah,
have
yeah.
used something to combat me. They could have had a very human reaction, but they still,
Mm,
despite the
mm,
shock, they had composure. And
mhm,
because they had their composure, I appreciated them despite what I
mhm,
thought they were not doing. And that not doing was, I thought they were being too passive for several
mhm.
sessions. I was
Yeah,
kind of running. I
yeah,
was like, where are we going? Is there something we're
yeah,
doing here?
yeah.
A
Good
part
for.
of that was because of the CBT that we're
Uh,
working together, and some of that is a little more passive than some other
mm,
types of therapy where
mm,
they're looking to
mm,
do like these almost grounding exercises where it's like a
mm,
stream of consciousness and whatever's coming to your brain at the moment is it's just articulated, and we see where it goes and where the branch cuts are, and if there's a consistent pattern, in this case, it was a dream where I was recurringly having a car accident. They wanted to see if we can have that in session, but it never happened quite that way. But the real breakthrough came when there was shared vulnerability where I confronted and they contorted a little bit and said, hey, you know what? Let's not make this the last session or anything. Let's try again next time. And it led to some sort of success.
Nice. Very cool. Very cool. So good on you for being honest and confronting him, and good on him for being honest in return. Very nice. It sounds like what we call a corrective emotional experience. So no wonder that was therapeutic. I absolutely understand why it would be, for sure, for sure. But to follow the train of thought again, right? So in your case, or in the therapist's case, it was just true. Like your observations were totally correct, and you had every reason to be mistrustful and so on. Okay, but the decision tree is you try to determine whether or not there's merit to the client's perceptions. In your case, there absolutely was. Okay. And any therapist worth their salt, they should be open to the possibility that the patient's perceptions have truth, or are entirely truthful for that matter. Like you can't be defensive. You have to really take the patient's perceptions very, very seriously. Yeah, and it could be partially true and partially not true. It could be that part of the patient's perception of the therapist is true, but another part isn't. And so, however you parse that and dice it, the idea is just to get to the truth of it collaboratively. Like, let's look at this. So I see that you're having this perception of me. You could be right. I'm not aware of that. Your therapist, he was aware that it was true immediately, and he did the right thing and fessed up, so that he did the right thing. But sometimes the patient will tell me that they're perceiving me in a certain manner, but that doesn't fit with my experience, right? So I might say, you could be right for all I know. We all have an unconscious, maybe you're picking up on something that I'm not aware of. I'm open to the possibility that you could be right. Okay. I'm not aware of it though. Or let's say they're thinking I'm criticizing them or devaluing them or thinking less of them in some form or fashion. I might say, not that I'm aware of. I'm human. I'm not immune from that phenomena. So it could be happening, but I'm not conscious of that. What are you seeing that is leading you to that conclusion? So you're investigating. You just begin an investigation.
It's good that we have these parameters and guardrails, because if we don't, we end up sleeping with our patients. Like Freud, right?
Yeah.
I'm picking on him a little bit because
right.
A lot of if you're not careful with the transference, from what I understand, things like this could happen, especially if you don't have proper supervision or means of accountability. And sometimes the signal that's coming is coming direct from the person in front of you who does not know all this stuff, right? They're
True.
acting in the moment. So as a facilitator, as a practitioner, I would assume that you would have to be made aware of this through a lot of exposure and hence a lot of training. So
professional guardrails are absolutely critical. You need those professional guardrails. But the other possibility is that the patient is distorting the therapist, that it's actually not true at all.
Gaslighting.
Well, they may not be doing it consciously. Gaslighting implies that they're doing it intentionally, consciously. But it could be an entirely unconscious process where they're importing and displacing a relational template that is really pertinent and relevant and accurate with someone else, but they're importing that and superimposing that template onto the therapist unconsciously. And it's a distortion, right? It's a distortion, and it's what we call the transference resistance. This is transference. And so the patient is saying, I think you're devaluing me, right? Or bullying me or whatever, but really it was their father that bullied them. That would be the transference resistance. If it's a projection, they are actually bullying the therapist, but they're projecting that onto the therapist. So there's all kinds of possibilities in terms of what you're dealing with. But your job as a therapist is just to keep an open mind and look at where the data takes you. So you investigate it with an open mind.
Do you for lack of a better word, when the transference resistance is occurring in
Mm,
session, and
mhm,
you're not actually aware of who or what they're possibly projecting onto you. Let's say they've
mhm,
never mentioned the fact that they have an uncle that looks kind of like
mhm,
you or has the
mhm,
same mannerisms as you. And that's
mhm,
who they're really projecting against right then through the
mhm,
transference resistance.
mhm,
How do you figure out as a therapist
mhm.
the source of conflict, like the person in the source of conflict that's precipitating this? So there's some
Yeah,
unknown
yeah.
person or factor. How do you know that it's the
Mhm,
the
mhm,
projection at that point?
mhm. Well, you're describing a later stage in the causal sequence. So, step
Okay.
number one is to simply first pick up on the fact that they're relating to you in a way that isn't commensurate to the way you are. So, the way you first detect it is that they're relating to you in a way that actually doesn't fit the situation at hand. They're relating to you as if you are doing or being in a totally different way than the way you actually are.
Hmm.
Like if someone were to approach you as if you're bullying them, but you're being polite and docile, you would go, huh, well, there's a disconnect here somewhere. I'm not doing any of these things that they're accusing
Hmm.
me of, right?
Mhm.
Again, with an open mind to the fact that maybe you are, but you're not aware of it. You always have to be open to the possibility that the patient is picking up on something that you're not conscious of. But if it's your determination that there is a discrepancy, that they're actually not relating to you in a way that is commensurate to the way you are, right? Then you begin to bring that to their attention. And you say, I noticed that you're becoming combative with me, or I noticed that you seem to be doing both parts of the relationship here. You answer your own questions and so on and so forth. Would it be okay with you if we take a few minutes to investigate and explore what might be happening here between us? Because maybe this connects to what originally brought you in.
Hmm.
Okay. So
Okay.
first you want their permission to even investigate the matter. Assuming you have that permission, then you look into it and you say, what's going on here? What am I doing or saying that leads you to the conclusion that I'm doing X, Y, and Z or whatever, right? What you're hoping for, Nathan, is that the patient will begin to become aware that the way you really are is quite different from what they were thinking. You
Hmm.
want the patient to become aware of their own distortion mechanism. Then you could say, would it be in line with your priorities that together we investigate and get to the bottom of what's happening, that a part of your mind is distorting me? And is it only here with me that you end up seeing me as a jerk? Or is that also happening in other relationships and in other parts of your life? And they might say, no, this is something I'm actually quite familiar with. I do this a lot, actually. And then you could say, is that part of what brought you to me? Is that part of what you're wanting to get to the bottom of? And then you're off and running. Then you can get to the underlying drivers. Eventually, you'll get to the uncle, but that's like at the end of the causal sequence here.
Okay.
You,
Yes, I
you
jumped a few
see,
steps there then. Okay.
yeah, but
'Cause-
you get to that eventually, you see.
okay. Yeah, because I would I'm not sure how I would react if someone did that other than try to observe their behavior.
But one important caveat when it comes to this transference thing, this is
Hmm.
important, is that so you have this uncle who treated you poorly. You're
Hmm.
transferring the template of your uncle onto your therapist, let's
Hmm.
say.
Hmm.
Okay. And the therapist actually happens to embody some of your uncle's qualities. Okay.
Hmm.
He's not necessarily treating you poorly, but maybe
Hmm.
he
His
cracks a joke,
mannerisms. Hmm.
mannerisms, or he jokes in a
Hmm.
similar way, or what have you. Or he actually uses a kind of sharp tone sometimes, the way your uncle did, let's say.
Hmm.
So then other evidence of transference is that there actually is some overlap between the therapist and the uncle, but your emotional response is not in proportion to the stimuli from the therapist. So it isn't just that, you can have one situation where the patient's reaction isn't commensurate at all to anything going on with the therapist, but the other alternative is that the therapist actually is doing some things that the uncle did, but the emotional response from the patient is really out of proportion to
So
the
they're, yeah.
stimulus.
So the patient's limbic system is reacting in such a way as if you are really their uncle, and their brain
Yes,
doesn't know the difference. And
right.
it's our job to understand that, first and foremost, that we are finite creatures, and this is likely to happen just because of similarities
Mm-hmm,
between people, personality
mm-hmm,
types, mannerisms, tone, etc.
mm-hmm,
Maybe physicality, maybe you
mm-hmm,
look like the uncle,
mm-hmm,
maybe in a
mm-hmm,
Rorschach-ian kind of way they see into you, in the way
mm-hmm,
that they see their uncle,
mm-hmm,
whatever it may be. That
mm-hmm,
part maybe not be as important as much as realizing that there is a relationship, even a one that you may not be able to detect, either you at a
mm-hmm,
conscious level, but
mm-hmm,
the behavior that you observe is not commensurate
mm-hmm,
with what most people would find reasonable.
mm-hmm,
So in the case with
mm-hmm,
me and my
mm-hmm,
therapist, let's just throw me
mm-hmm,
out there for a second. Maybe there was
mm-hmm,
something that I was projecting upon them that reminded me something about my environment or person in my
mm-hmm,
environment and some sort of
mm-hmm,
fragment, whatever.
mm-hmm.
Um,
Exactly.
and then they
Exactly.
recognize like, wait, he's usually pretty well mannered. I mean, he's kind of
Mm-hmm,
tightly wound, but he's never really reacted this way. What's going on?
mm-hmm,
I'm being
mm-hmm,
patient.
mm-hmm,
I'm doing my usual thing.
mm-hmm,
Okay. He's looking for some sort of truth. I'm just going to tell him the truth. Yes,
mm-hmm,
I'm, Nathan, I'm really sorry. I've been
mm-hmm,
kind of overworked this week. I had a couple
mm-hmm,
difficult cases with
mm-hmm,
in the
mm-hmm,
morning that
mm-hmm,
it should not affect you, but it is right
mm-hmm.
now, and I want to acknowledge it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. So that would be a perfect example of what I'm trying to illustrate right now. In other words, there's some truth to your perception of the therapist, right? But the intensity of your reaction to the therapist means that there might be transference in the picture. So one doesn't cancel out the other.
Let's go to the uncle for a second.
Mm,
Let's say he actually is overbearing. He's maybe a little rough
mm,
with the nephew or whatever.
mm,
The client is now projecting onto you the uncle, the template of they have the uncle in the moment. It's not
mm-hmm,
commensurate with what's going on in the room. You just
mm-hmm,
looked a
mm-hmm,
certain way. Your
mm,
face twitched, whatever.
mm,
You blinked
mm,
funny. It triggered the unconscious response, triggered their
mm-hmm,
limbic system, and now they're getting heated.
mm-hmm,
You, as a
mm-hmm,
therapist, if you are perceiving that the uncle was overbearing, or you had this knowledge ahead of time
mm,
that
mm,
then the
mm,
uncle is overbearing, do you
mm,
lower your pressure and intensity with the person at the moment, or
mm.
are you a wall then at that point, and you allow them to 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 play it out,
Mm,
or do you
mm,
lower
mm,
your own intensity, if that makes sense?
mm. Yeah, I thought you'd never ask. Um, no, so here's the thing. So it comes down to whether or not the patient has reality testing intact. If the patient knows at some level that the extent of their anger isn't quite commensurate to the therapist, if you know that they know that there is a transference, not in that lingo, of course, but they know that there's something here that isn't just about my therapist, right?
Their theory of
And they,
mind is operating at
yeah,
some point.
and they know that the therapist isn't actually violating them or anything like that. They're just being reminded. They're just being reminded. Now, if you know that as a therapist, you can increase the pressure and the challenge, assuming you don't see any contraindications. Like I said before, the stride is signaling, the skeletal muscle tissue is containing that anxiety. You see that reality testing is intact. The patient wants to get to the bottom of things. That's a green light to keep pressuring and challenging.
Okay.
If you're not sure, then don't ramp up the pressure and the challenge. First, ensure that the patient has intact reality testing and they know the difference between you and the uncle.
Hmm.
And if they don't, if they feel like, no, there is no difference between you and my uncle, you really are wronging me,
Hmm.
then you got to clean that up first and foremost.
It reminds me of the one Davanloo transcript we read about the CEO, and and Davanloo commenting that the way that you're treating me right now reminds me of the way that you talked about your conflicts with your coworkers or whatever.
Mm,
I
mm,
don't remember which one that is, but having sort of a a memory
Mm,
thing there. I'll have to figure that one out. Thanks for that.
mm,
I know I kind
mhm,
of maybe asking the same questions over and over again, but
yeah,
it's helping me
bring it up.
formulate a better
Yeah,
picture,
yeah,
especially
bring
as
it
a
up.
layman. If anyone's listening to this, maybe they
Mm-hmm.
could relate to some of the
Mm-hmm.
more personal things here, because
Mm-hmm.
maybe we all have
Yeah.
an uncle that we project out into the world. There's
Yeah.
something, some
Yeah.
boogeyman. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
it's maybe it's
Mm-hmm.
people of a certain race or something. Maybe it's
Mm-hmm.
people
Mm-hmm.
of a certain sex,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe
Mm-hmm.
all people of this category or whatever. Because then we're talking not just
Yeah.
about personal pathology, we're talking about like sort of
Mm-hmm.
the collective unconscious in
Mm-hmm.
a way. And if the
Ain't that
collective
the truth?
unconscious has, well, to get to
Mm-hmm.
Jung here for a moment, his
Mm-hmm.
insight, which I think is important,
Mm-hmm.
is
Mm-hmm.
if we allow the inner turmoil in people's lives
Mm-hmm.
to go unchecked,
Mm-hmm.
eventually the mass of people who constitute that same sort of pattern of psychic patterns, I guess, will
Mm-hmm.
manifest in ways in society at large to make society sick as well. So
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this may be this, the interpersonal may be the insight into the non-personal mass
Mm-hmm.
as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why this is so important.
Yeah, I agree with you. Here's the good news from my point of view.
Hmm.
ISTDP metapsychology, and I think psychodynamic theory in general, um, articulates the solution to the individual having to use the world as their dumping grounds, where they have to transfer or project their psychic sewage and waste onto the world, let's say, right?
Hmm.
In other words, the solution to you seeing your uncle wherever you go, I'm just not you personally, but hypothetically,
I
the
know what you mean.
solution, yeah, the solution is that you realize that you do have unresolved feelings towards that uncle, so you don't have to displace that conflict onto other people, right? And then strain your interpersonal relations. But instead, you realize, no, it really is my uncle that I have to metabolize my feelings towards. And then you face those feelings with the help of the therapist, not necessarily confronting the uncle in real life. He might be dead for all we know, but at least internally, really facing the depths of your emotions towards the uncle that were never fully faced, that
Well,
were
this the
tuned
integration of
out.
the shadow. Yeah.
There you go. There
Sort
you
of
go.
to put
So
it to
that's the
put it in
good
that
news.
language. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the
So
good
the
news.
mhm.
That's the
Yeah, that
hope for the individual and for the collective. Nathan, we're nearing the end of our time. I really want to thank you for all of your input, your commentary, particularly the personal stuff. Uh, very appreciative of that.
mhm.
And I'm excited to keep going. This is fun for me. I hope it's fun for you.
Yeah, it's very challenging, invigorating. All the reading I have to do outside the book itself has been very difficult, but very rewarding at the same time. I look forward to us doing a another session and getting to a transcript of sorts, getting our
Oh,
feet wet,
yeah.
so to speak.
Oh, yeah.
So
Let's do that. Let's do that. Fun, fun,
yeah,
fun. And
yeah.
just for clarification, by session, you mean these. They're not clinical sessions. We're just hanging out,
Right, right, right,
reading
right.
Davanloo. Yeah.
Reading Davanloo's
Yeah.
transcripts. I should be
Yeah.
more specific
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
as
Just so there's
they
no
inform the
confusion.
discipline. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So, anyway, thanks a lot. And I'll see you next time.
We'll see you next time. Bye.
Okay.